Welcome to the Viking Sculpture tutorial story. It chronologizes the entire process of the Viking sculpture from beginning to end. That does include the sculpting, molding, and casting. Please enjoy. These following slides, you'll see the oil-based clay, obviously your hands, a smoothing tool, and an armature. These will be some of the tools you'll be using when creating a sculpture. After I created the armature, I applied the clay and just started a trial and error sculpting process. Considering this was my first ever attempt at a bust or head form. And as you notice, this was an attempt at a self-portrait. Later I realized that a self-portrait isn't what I really wanted to do. If you look at the eyes, at first I put in some wooden balls. That didn't really work, and I had brought back some fake eyes that we had been using at the studio for dinosaurs and put them in. And if you look closely at the sculpture, the protruding jaw, I did change that. Apparently, after reading some sculpture books, that's quite a common error in a first-time sculpture. But as you look, the evolution of the sculpture, changing, and ultimately, I think I did the sculpture more than 3 times. This part of the sculpture, I actually brought it to my living room table and was more focused than ever because I was told that I was doing too much talking and not enough working, and ultimately that happens when creating a sculpture or any kind of artwork. Stop talking about it and just do it. Only put off until tomorrow what you're willing to die having left undone. Pablo Picasso. A quote from Cellini. I say that the art of sculpture is 8 times as great as any other art based on drawing, because a statue has 8 views and they must all be equally good. For this reason is why I was never satisfied with the first attempt at anything on my sculpture. Yeah, the beard hair was actually created by using a small extruder that I bought at Hobby Lobby and fused 2 together and then applied one shorter and one longer. Also, it's very important that when you're creating a hair on a sculpture that to make sure all areas are sealed, because what happens is when you're making the mold, the silicone seeps in and it creates an issue with your final casting that you'll have to clean at the end. If you've noticed, the eyebrows on the sculpture started out very thick, and I realized that that just does not look very realistic, so I tried 3 different attempts, and the final one is just a small piece of clay and used a very small tool which gave more of a lifelike eyebrow. Here's me putting the final grooves and smoothing out in between each of the helmet grooves. Don't laugh at my hair. And if you look, I actually used texture pads to create texture on the helmet to give it a more realistic look. Try to use styrofoam as much as possible in creating a larger sculpture bust, because clay is just too heavy and wasteful and ultimately expensive. But when you're done using styrofoam, make sure you just put basic house paint on it so your clay doesn't stick. For any of those who are wondering why there's a stick in the head of the sculpture, that's because the armature couldn't hold all the weight of the clay on the head, which caused some cracking in the face. And I did that as an extra support so my sculpture didn't fall apart. Here's me just discussing or describing the steps that I've done to get to this point, just putting the clay on the shoulders, getting ready to smooth it out. As mentioned previously, just a closer look at all the areas that I have to fill in before the molding process on the beard. Again, here's one of the many different variations of like a cape that I decided to use for the sculpture, just one of two, and then you'll see one later that is an attempt at an animal fur, which I decided against. As discussed earlier, here's the animal fur attempt, but if you look closely at the beard, there's a lot of screw holes in there, and again, that's to hold the clay onto the armature so the head doesn't fall apart. Just roughed out the cape for the Viking sculpture along with the leather strap holding the cape on. The following clips are me just basically showing how to use burlap for the texture. And that's the texture created from the use of burlap. This is me pounding out clay before putting it into the clay roller. Just makes it easier to roll a uniform piece. Also, if you can't afford or do not have access to a clay roller, this is a great way to make clay your desired thickness. So, like I said, it's all work in progress, everyone. But right now it doesn't have to be too perfect, but it's a pretty clean working canvas in which we just rolled off this rolling machine. So, again, it's how important a mallet, you see the mallet there, and the rolling table to roll out your clay. Using a wooden dowel just to apply the texture. The final application of the burlap texture to the front of the Viking. Removing the nose guard so that I can make a separate mold for that and attach it later to the final sculpture. Here's a closer look at the Viking artifact that I'll be placing on the helmet of the sculpture. I thought it'd be very important to use period pieces to give the sculpture a more realistic look. The following short videos and slides are me making a mold of authentic Viking artifacts I'll be placing on the Viking helmet. You'll see the final castings as well. Okay, right now we're going to be working on the, remember I was making the molds earlier? There's the mold and there's the little castings that are going to go around the helmet. Here's a close-up of the final application of the Viking artifacts applied to the helmet. It definitely gives it a more realistic look. I'm glad I did that. Also, again, remember the texture that I added to the helmet. Here's me putting the aluminum shims, which can be found at any hardware store around the sculpture, which will help and aid in the molding process. In the next slides you'll see I'm putting on the mold dams around the sculpture. Here the mold dams are almost complete, and also here's a first look at the Nefertiti sculpture that I have already completed. The sculpture is being prepared to add man's mold release found at smoothon.com. Mixing of the Rebound 25, again bought at smoothon.com. This is the first application of Rebound 25, otherwise known as print coat. Again, please follow the instructions as laid out for you in the Smoothon molding and casting manual that you can receive from their online store at www.smoothon.com. Again, it's very imperative that you cover everything in this print coat. And always be on the lookout for dinosaurs. When making molds with silicone, it's very important to add pigment to different layers so that you know if you've missed a piece or not. This too can also be found on Smoothon. Oftentimes when applying the silicone, you miss areas. Make sure to double check. As stated in the Smooth On Molding and Casting manual, it's very important that you beef up the undercuts like eyes, underneath the nose, underneath the neck. The reason for this is because when you're pulling out the casting, you definitely don't want to rip the silicone when you're pulling the casting out of the mold. So please follow the directions in the manual. Okay, this is after the fifth coat of the Rebound 25. I'm getting ready to make the mother mold. I'm putting in sections. I've been following the Smooth On catalog right over here. As stated previously a number of times, please follow the instructions manual provided for you by Smooth On to avoid any catastrophes. Through trial and error, I found that clay would not hold the shims on properly, so I used a glue gun to keep the aluminum shims on the original mold. Here's a closer look at the three-part mother mold. Also, please pay close attention to the use of keys during the creation of this mother mold. Another product offered by Smooth On is Sonite Wax 2, which I've used exclusively to put on the mold so that the mother mold comes off, and it also helps in the removal of the three-part mother mold from each piece. Also, this takes a closer look at the shims on the three-part mold along with the various keys that you'll see very shortly. Make sure you put a lot of Sonite wax in those keyholes so the mother mold can be separated. In this mother mold, I use Plasti-Paste 1. Let me just caution you, don't take apart the mother mold until it is completely hardened. Just save you a lot of time and energy. Tools used to separate the mother mold. Also, a fiberglass scraping tool used to smooth off or get any rough edges found on the mother mold. After removing the silicone from your original, make sure you clean out the clay from all the crevices, otherwise it may cause an error in your castings. Using bolts to secure the mother mold together. Smooth Cast 325 was used in the hollow casting of the Viking Sculpture. I found through trial and error that it was easier to mix smaller portions of resin then apply them in parts to the mold, making it for a more uniform casting. This also allows you to make thinner castings at more affordable price using Smooth Cast 325 and bronze. Again, the first casting of the Viking Warrior Sculpture. Thank you for watching the story tutorial on how this was made. I learned a lot throughout the entire process. Most importantly, never give up and never be satisfied. Here are pictures of the second and third castings of the Viking Warrior. Thank you for your time. Please follow me on YouTube. I will also be showing the sculpture tutorial story of the Nefertiti that is already completed and other sculpture tutorials.